So a lot's changed here recently in the last 3 years. Before, cannabis was awesome just because it was cannabis. Now we've got like global market shifting, different changes in policies, supply chain issues that we've never even seen before. So great we can all be in a room again together. Yay, that's kind of an exciting thing. Just a quick little disclaimer I have to give. I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a CPA, I'm not an investment analyst, I'm a fund manager of Multiverse Capital, own a variety of companies. But make sure that you use good lawyers, good tax accountants, because at the end of the day, this is, in the United States, federally illegal. Internationally, completely in contrary to all drug policies and laws, and we're breaking rules in different jurisdictions, so you have to know what you're doing. You cannot guess. And those professionals, they're kind of guessing too, but a little bit more educated than some of us, so just make sure to use some of those professionals. I do swear often, and just in the nature, and if I do offend your company or country, it's just based on the industry. It's nothing personal. Quick little high level of background. I've been in the space for almost 16 years, from farm country in Wisconsin, all the way to being a linguist for the military, got hurt, went to Colorado to some beautiful mountains in 2006, right when Colorado was changing from a medical program that allowed commercial production. So Colorado was the first state in the United States that allowed you to actually profit with medical cannabis in 2008. California, 1996, the Compassionate Care Act, first medical state in the US, but we were the first ones that we could do it as a business, not as a nonprofit. Little behold, we were also the first that allowed adult use cannabis. So in 2012, we legalized regulate marijuana like alcohol, Prop 64. 2014, we had the first legal adult use sales where you could have a company profiting, from adult use cannabis. And that day, one of our stores was the third to open. And that was the day, we had lawyers on retainers. It was the first time it wasn't medical, and if the feds were gonna come in, that was the moment. They didn't. We did millions of dollars in revenue. Colorado's already done $10 billion in adult use sales. I've owned part of an adult use business for over 8 years in Colorado, profiting from cannabis, violating federal law. Where are they? So, have been around, seen a lot, so I'm not guessing in some of these assumptions. Global cannabis in 2022, some of the projections, when you think about last year, over $35 billion in revenue, global cannabis, medical and adult use. When you think of where was that revenue? 88% in the United States. We're federally illegal. Canada, 9%. They barely top out around 3 billion US. Canadian, it sounds a lot better, but And it used to be we had to be careful talking about dollars and euros, but right now we're all the same, which is kind of hilarious. Sorry about that. A little touchy, but now is a good time to buy stuff in Europe compared to typically. But then the rest of the fucking world, 1%. 1%. And here, I started working international in 2014 in Canada, then Denmark, and that first crazy German tender, then winning Danish companies, and then Portugal and South Africa, massive expansion, 1%. So not to say the rest of the world doesn't matter, because it does, but what's happening in the United States, similar to the honor that we have to give to the Netherlands for allowing their seed breeder programs and really starting the genetics that just went from cheese or skunk or whatever, typical things, especially if there's UK people here. They were the first to allow certain things. The United States is taking consumer culture to a whole new level of products, edibles, beverages. International medical is all about compassionate use, which means it can just be an API, an active pharmaceutical ingredient, flour or bulk oil. All compounding has to happen in pharmacies, so it's not I'm gonna make vape cartridges in Portugal and sell them to German medical. It's that doesn't work that way. In the US, it does. But we're really the guinea pig market. What products work, what do consumers like, what packaging, marketing, and as we navigate in the United States, since it's federally illegal, each state's its own little country, violating federal law, but using state laws to do it. So the things that the rest of the world can learn, we know what people like. I don't care if you're European, Asian, American, South African, it doesn't matter, we're people. Now there are certain cultures that have different things where they might like salty or they might like sweet, different taste profiles. But at the end of the day, we're people. What delivery methods work? What types of hashes have been popular, and what will a program allow? Because some states in the US, they would only allow smokable flour. Georgia, 5% THC oil or less. So like each little place is different, so you always have to adapt your business plan to what that place is gonna do. Now in the United States, it's kind of, like I said, each state's like its own little country. We only have a couple little holdouts, but, and again, sorry for the last couple of years, the America show, like our soap opera has been pretty dramatic. Lots of like page turners there, and sorry if we kind of look like ridiculous in the past, and so women can still vote, at least in America. We got that going for us. So even though it looks a little crazy in what's happening, when we focus on the cannabis industry from like Colorado, California, some of these new adult use states, some of the ones that are on the cusp of changing, and when each state does this and legalizes, it's a new market opportunity. But I can't grow cannabis at a legal operation in California and sell it in a different state. Everything I produce in the state, I have to sell in the state, no crossing state lines. When that changes, we always have to think like agricultural vectors. Like this is an agricultural commodity, and I'm a farm kid. Like I love growing cannabis, but I love growing tomatoes and echinacea. And when we look at other agricultural industries, what works for production methodologies, indoor is really popular right now because we are illegal, so we went indoors to hide. But what other plants do we commercially produce on a viable scale in warehouses or in little growth chambers or with fancy LED lights, greenhouses, outdoor? Our operations, I have one operation in Colombia, I could literally supply the whole world with cannabis from. But indoors, high cost of capital, high cost of construction, high operational costs. When you do hydroponic or other things, a system failure, it's like life support and the plants die. But when you really think of like what works and like where could I produce cannabis where I have a better climate, temperature, like cheaper land, better taxes, that's where cannabis is gonna come from long term. So in the US, pre-federal legalization, patchwork little framework, eventually where in the US is gonna be cheapest to mass produce and sell, and then after international legalization happens, that's where the countries that are closest to the equator will be the winners. Like we're gonna stop growing pineapples in warehouses in Germany to have pineapples. We'll bring them from where it's cheap to produce. But currently, that's not allowed. But the United States is definitely a model we can learn from. So international medical cannabis, there's so much supply from some of these lower cost of production nations. Even like Portugal, great in the European Union, but when you look at South Africa, Thailand potentially moving forward, Colombia, Peru, some of these other countries, the cost of production there, I could make a kilo of EU G-compliant cannabis for less than 10 euros. And then here we're talking about allowing it for 10 euros a gram and like setting certain standards, and you're like, there's gonna be a massive disconnect. And then oversupply currently happening internationally because without a doctor's prescription, in the US it's doctor's recommendations because they can't give a prescription for cannabis unless it's Epidiolex, Marinol, like other synthetic cannabinoids. So international, without doctors being educated about the benefits of cannabis and being willing to write a prescription, patients don't get it. I mean, Germany didn't even do 350 million euros in sales last year of medical, and it's the largest medical market in the EU and in the world outside of the United States. But when you think of 350 million euros for all of the medical patients that are happening here, Colorado, just to put it in perspective, did close to 3 billion last year. That's with 6 million people. You got close to 90 million people here. So it's just a matter of time, but we have to do doctor education. We have to come up with a federal and international medical system before adult use. That's exactly what we did in the United States in each and every state that went from medical to adult use. Here's a little stat for you. 100% of the time in the United States, if you had a medical license in a state, you're first in line for adult use. Doesn't mean you're making a ton of money sometimes in those medical days, but if you're willing to bleed and you can hold that position, you will most likely be rewarded internationally. So those 3 crappy companies, no offense to y'all if you're here, that have the production licenses in Germany, depending on how supply is gonna happen, they might be first in line for this. So there's a time and a place when holding a position can be great, but if you can't withstand the market pressures, it will crush you, like a bad short or a bad investment. Now with international adult use happening, we've got a couple examples. Spanish social clubs, the Netherlands, we have Luxembourg with what they had planned to do that then couldn't happen, and now Germany. And Germany, really, really unique in how they're planning on doing adult use. The implementation is going to be the problem, because you have all of these international organizations, from the International Narcotics Control Board, the UN with 3 treaties, like the 1961 Single Convention Treaty on Psychotropic Substances, kind of a mouthful, and the 71 and the 1978 Indian Pharmacies Act. There's all these different policies that kind of go over this. So where is supply going to come from? Like, we don't know that, because not only in Germany and how they decided to legalize and are still working on, it's not just like the United States doing their own thing, or Canada doing their own thing, or Uruguay doing their own thing. You're members of the European Union, and that's actually the biggest problem. If you violate UN law, what are they gonna do, sanctions? This isn't Russia with Ukraine right now. It's like, oh, Canada legalized recreational, like let's cut off SWIFT to Canada. Like, it didn't happen. We were terrified with Uruguay. Uruguay was like Colorado in 2014. They legalized adult use and we're like, ooh. And they're like a small little country. We're like, crackdown, nothing, nothing. So, you know, the European Union's really what could crack down, because there are a lot of policies there. So first, decriminalization is huge in how we could do this. Home grow isn't as hard to regulate and easier based on like what countries would allow, but the issue with home grow, just like home brewing, it's super intensive. You have to like wash all the bottles, have the carboys, do all the labeling. Like, how many people do that and do it well? And it also can be an environmental catastrophe. It's kind of bad for the industry, but if that's what it takes to legalize it, it's better. I mean, if you can grow your own tobacco or brew your own beer, why don't we all do that? Because we're convenient little creatures and we like things easy. Like, if I can buy a 6-pack for €5, 10 euros, why would I actually like go to the trouble of brewing beer? But people do it, and that craft stuff is great, but that's probably one of the keys that we could get international done. And when you think about all these organizations that kind of govern this, especially in the United States, like the DEA with their very cute little logo, like kind of assholes. And then America, we were the world police. We're like, America. And when we pretty much went after medical cannabis and cannabis just to get rid of hemp back in the 30s, a few US white asshole men, all dead, thank God, but their policies exist. We caused this, and I'm sorry, like, it's one of those like neoliberalism, like way too early, and it's like, oh, let's make hemp illegal, but by doing it, thinking about how cannabis was so bad. You know, Jack Herrera, one of our heroes in the space, like his book, The Emperor Wears No Clothes, if you want to understand how cannabis got illegal, look into that. Because it was never about cannabis being dangerous for like our health. It was already a part of different pharmaceutical kind of regulations, botanical compacts way early in the 1850s. And one of the reasons cannabis isn't that sexy to pharmaceutical companies is because there's this thing called the safety profile. When you make a standardized drug, if you make something new and you own it and it passes that safety profile, you're Viagra for that industry for 20 plus years. It passed that safety profile in the 1850s, so there's nothing that sexy about owning cannabis per se. But when you think about this like whole scheme of regulations from like UN drug law, European Union drug law, how these compacts work between countries, navigating this is terrifying as an investor, but if you do it well, you're gonna be in a good position. Now, the International Narcotics Control Board, not a fan of anything that's happening, but what the fuck are they doing about it? They're complaining, they're not enforcing, they're not cracking down. But would they, especially in the European Union, if supply starts happening from, one of the key ways people are thinking about doing this, using this as an example, would be like, okay, I'm producing EUG, like GACP compliant and EUG compliant cannabis in, let's say, Colombia. I sell it to a medical importer in Germany. That medical distributor accepts that product, but now it's in a country that's legal, so now we can label it adult use cannabis. Not exactly, at all. But that's one of the quickest and easiest ways that most people think that this is gonna happen. But we have to be very, very careful about these because they haven't enforced yet, but if they did, what it would cause to the industry could be catastrophic. But I don't think it's gonna happen. If countries, you know, prevent youth access, do proper education, these are things like safety and security, not allowing like foreign crimes that are gonna really allow this. European Union is kind of huge, and the big thing I wanted to just mention here, it's like tobacco is estimated to be 263 billion euros in the EU. Alcohol, 467. Of that, about 37% beer, about 40% wine and spirits, and the rest is kind of like a lot of these new seltzers and different things that are changing. But I love how they said that the illicit cannabis market was $9 billion last year. The DEA used to say that the illegal cannabis market in the United States was $50 billion. It's closer to like 200 billion in the United States, and it's probably closer to 300 billion here in Europe. But how do they have good, accurate reporting on this based on crimes and costs? It's enormous. And like, smoking's cool over here, not as cool in Europe, in America. But when we see some of these changes happen, like what opportunity, this will be like the second largest market in the world. The US, we got a head start on you. You have more people though. And it's gonna be a lot easier to regulate this when you do it from an EU standpoint than like state by state, each little state guessing how to do this. But learn from what we've done in the US to do this. I mean, you've had some major strides for medical here in the EU, but what has that led to in terms of revenue, valuations, growth propositions? It's been great for patients, disabled vet myself, that's how I got into this space. We always have to focus on the patients, but we're all people. We all have these endocannabinoid systems, so who are gonna be the ones that are like the leaders in supplying this? Big thing I always kind of say, it's like when you think about the world and others have, it's like where are these key positions and where do they matter? You got one shot to put your pieces down on the board, unless you have a whole shit ton of capital. If so, we should talk. Don't go into this game alone. The due diligence is insane, which I'll get into, knowing what's like a good investment. For people that have been around for over a decade, I've seen thousands of like a similar business plan. Other times, you might not have access to like unique deal flow. So like you have to know where and how to put that capital, but it's always knowing the rules to play the game, and each one's gonna be different. Just because you can do one thing in Jamaica or one thing in South Africa doesn't mean that you're gonna be able to do it everywhere. So it's not the same as traditional business, but it does follow a lot of the same kind of histories. So why is cannabis like super sexy for investing now? We're the largest growing emerging industry in the history of the world. Fastest and largest. Bigger than .coms, because .coms didn't have the internet to like boost their company or influencers to get people to buy products back then. Huge. How long did it take the alcohol industry to evolve? How long did it take the tobacco industry to evolve? We got 20 years max on this, and that timeline has started. So if you want to be Jameson, you want to be Philip, you want to be British American Tobacco, now's the frickin' time. And you don't want to start little startup companies for 500K here, 500 euros there. It's all about like mergers and acquisitions, and we've seen copious amounts of that in the United States. But now is the time that when companies are bleeding, they used to think, I'm worth 100 million. You're actually probably worth 20. So like you can get more for your buck right now than you could ever before. When it comes to some of the public companies, they're lower than we've ever seen. And granted, public market investing's crazy. Like the public versus private and trying to choose which ones. But if there's ever been a time, like it's like that thing with a tree, like the best time to plant a tree 20 years ago, the next best time is today. Private capital, we don't have institutional capital that can flow into this because they're too risk adverse to like being the first in the water. That's why a lot of giant banks and social institutions, they're not into this yet. That's why private offices, family offices, multifamily offices, so vital for the growth of this industry. A lot of companies are struggling though, because like in the United States, we have a weird tax code called the IRC 280E. We can't deduct our business costs. So let's say I do 10 million in revenue, 5 million in cost, I should pay taxes on 5 million. Sometimes I'll pay taxes on 7 to 9 million, even if I only had 5 million in costs. It's absolutely ridiculous. They can't scale as quickly as possible. They overprojected their markets thinking like, oh, I'm gonna get this Colombian production license and I'll supply the whole world, so I'll put 70 million euros into this thing. And it's like, well, how can it be scalable? And how can a business grow as market demand grows? But the supply chain issues that happened during coronavirus, I mean, the cost of steel for me, the cost of glass, I used to be a big fan of like new buildings, but now being able to retrofit things and get to market faster, the same thing that I used to be able to build 3 years ago is about 3 times more money to build the exact same thing today, and takes about twice as long, which is, you're like, oh shit, that's only 3 years. What changed? Coronavirus, supply chains, employment side, and now as we're starting to rebuild, everything is in such high demand that suppliers actually can't even keep up because they're all startups too. Like every single company that's growing and like all of that original revenue, like 35 billion last year, almost 200 billion in ancillary services for real estate, construction, legal, consulting, investment, due diligence. Everyone's backed up right now. So the due diligence that most investors miss on a normal project, like, is this a unique market advantage? Like, what's the true valuation of this company? Like, due diligence is a whole new level now. One thing that I can say to investors, just take that word cannabis out of the deal flow equation. Is this a viable business, not just because it's a sexy new thing? Can it function independently of being cannabis and like, oh, it's a CBD company, and like, oh, I've seen that in gas stations, I should invest into that. Not a good idea. Don't buy those products at gas stations. But when it comes to like the products, did they protect their IP? What's that team? Do they have the ability to actually execute on this? Is it a diverse team? I mean, in the United States, we have the worst social justice problem in cannabis in the history of ever. I mean, cannabis was made illegal by saying like Hispanics and African Americans were gonna like rape white women and reefer madness and insanity. And then meanwhile, almost 90% of cannabis arrests historically in the US are not white people, but we use cannabis the same across the board. So now there's big social equity programs which are huge in the US for like getting licenses in jurisdictions if you had a past cannabis crime. I had a company worth $247 billion in a cash acquisition that now the only way you can get those sorts of companies is if somebody or one of the original owners had a drug crime. But I've also lost a company because someone had a joint 13 years ago and didn't disclose it and lost a license in one of the most competitive markets in the US. So we've got this shifting kind of policy, but in the EU, when we polled people like what was most important, social equity is so low of like helping to like get people out of jail for like non-violent cannabis arrests, having diversity parameters, not just like rich white guy companies, but like females, minorities, like diversity is our strength in this industry. And if you're not having companies like that have diverse boards and others, investment's not gonna flow either. But the nice thing now is that ESG, like environmental socially governed companies, it's sexy. Like some funds have certain mandates just to invest into companies that have environmental and social mandates. And even our fund, we won't invest into companies unless they have a diverse board. So really think about how to diversify, not just to look good and get investment, because it's the right fucking thing to do. I mean, realistically, like this is a new industry. We can create it how we want. And we don't have to follow the same past framework. And depending on where your capital's coming from, like diversifying capital diversifies risk. A diversified team, I'm a biologist. Diversity is totally our strength in these businesses. A lot of them are failing though, because remember, this is a startup industry full of startup companies. Sometimes I'm like, I've been around doing this for a decade and a half, and I'm like, man, did we pass startup phase yet or not? But we're always thinking like lean and agile. I cleaned a toilet last week in an office. It was dirty. It's like sometimes you have to do everything when you're in these businesses, but like no company is perfect and they're always growing. The dot-com bubble was enormous. The cannabis bubble is even worse because it's so sexy and like good, but there's not enough due diligence and history and track record, but there are for some of us that have been around this long. So when you think about like public versus private, you know, I always make fun of Tilray and always will. Just change my mind. It's gonna be hard. But it's hard to raise money, shit. Like it's really hard to raise capital. If I go public and talk about all this cool stuff, money can just flow because different investors can do that. Like they can get in and they can get out. But private capital, on average, has had a 27x return versus public. Even in the times when, no laser, but like that bottom trough there, that was Rona. Like remember like March 17th, like we're all in PJs and shit. That's when I was awake for 4 days, wearing a T-Rex shirt and like watching the Canadian public companies just tank and just buying them like there was literally no tomorrow. Like investing my parents' like retirement funds. I'm like, oh, this is so, I'm like, this is risky, but I'm like, I think I know what I'm doing. We made massive crushes, especially before Biden got elected and this looked good. We actually are lower today as a public stock index than we were during the crash of 2020, which is crazy. And in the US, like our companies, like whew, non-cannabis companies, but most Canadian companies on average listed, over 40% down year to date. Even if you were to take €1 million and put 100,000 euros into like the 10 MSOs in the US, set it and forget it. Like now is the time, even if you do diversify into public, but diversifying into privates that are gonna be acquired by these giants once they get back on their feet, those are those 27x exits. It's not about like being Philip Morris sometimes, it's about being bought by them or who's gonna be bought by them first. And that's what we really try to strategically outline. So what do you gotta do to beat some of these odds? Let's just check on this rambling, okay, we've got a couple more. What do you gotta do to beat the odds now? As an investor or a company, you have to be unique. Everyone does this now. Like, this isn't 2014. You can't just list and think you're gonna be Canopy or Aurora or build a giant greenhouse in the tundra and think you're gonna supply the world with cannabis. Thought like it was a good idea. Sorry, Aurora. Didn't work out very well. Financial models, like, I don't spend time with like sexy models. I fall asleep with financial models. Like, if I can't see it and understand it through an Excel sheet, it doesn't make sense to me. If you have a 2-page financial model, I'm probably not gonna read it. Where are your assumptions coming from? Are they vetted? Have you thought about waste disposal? Have you thought about taxes? Have you thought about every aspect of pre-construction, building entitlements, sewer permits, 3-phase power upgrades, regulatory regime things, testing costs? Is your price $4,000 a kilo for the next 5 years? If so, I'm not turning to the next page. Sensitivity. So if you don't know how to model your companies and you're trying to raise capital, start on that now. If you're an investor, get some help with like reviewing these financial models, even some independent due diligence, confidentially, just to review their models and be like, do some stress tests on those. What happens? I didn't see the Ukraine thing happening at all. I thought it was just like Putin flexing, and then all of a sudden, like, our Ukrainian hemp companies are all like, ooh, that's okay. War, we didn't think about that. What other things could happen now? There's 8 billion people, it's a volatile world, prices are going up. They're never gonna come down. It's not like we're gonna find more natural gas somewhere and like solve all of our problems. Like, hit peak oil in the 70s. Goods are gonna keep getting more and more expensive. We're gonna have more and more issues. Old industries are turning to dinosaurs, but you have to have robust, good financial models. Real estate, if I knew what I knew now, I'd be a billionaire from cannabis real estate back in the day. In the US, each little city or places, you can't typically apply for a license without compliant real estate with an owner that says it's fine to do this. Less than 1% of real estate is actually compliant for cannabis typically. Production, manufacturing, retail. Are they gonna sign up? Not all cities say yes, so you can't just think every little place is gonna be good. But real estate will be, and has been so vital. It was for our Dutch licenses, for the Danish licenses, for the Portuguese licenses, for the German ones back in 2015. Real estate, if you're in cannabis, you're gonna have to have real estate. If you're in real estate, why be working and doing investments that you're getting 6% on? Like, I can't guarantee it, but I'd get you 18% on cannabis real estate all day, every day. And it's a problem because you got the UK Foreign Crimes Act that I can't take tons of money out of the UK, even investing into real estate in the United States, just being leased to a cannabis company. So like being able to like get good capital real estate, especially for debt, is important. These opportunity zones, so massive internationally as well. Like in the US, if I put a business in an opportunity zone and I spend 25 million euros building that thing out, if it's opportunity zone, the investors don't have to pay capital gains taxes on where the money came from. If it sits there for 5 to 7 years, depending on the jurisdiction, they don't have to pay capital gains on that investment. If you can tell that story to your investors and save them taxes on past gains and future gains of you, I don't even care if you're like raising baby elephants or whatever it might be. Like, tell the story to your investors and make it lucrative, not just for what you think's good, but what's gonna be good for them. There's all these pitfalls. You can plan so much. There can be all these business plans. The world changed so quickly, though, that in trying to adapt with that now and having robust supply chains, what if this vendor fails? How am I gonna scale? Not building out too big and taking over the world, bite by bite by bite. And even if you, like dude surfing, even if you do the best thing ever, there's random ass little jet skis that are just gonna like hit you out of the blue. How do you deal with that? Like, if you were sponsoring surfers, I wouldn't want to sponsor one, I'd sponsor 6 of them. What if one of them get eaten by a shark? You have to have diversity in your planning. And now is the time. Like, that sense of urgency to either get into this industry, because otherwise, if you wait a few years, yeah, a little less risky, we'll know what's gonna happen in Germany, we'll know what's gonna happen in other places. But now is literally the time where if you can diversify into this sector, it's the only thing worth doing. Be it in your country, your jurisdiction, if you supply even packaging or something, like, how do you get into this industry? If alcohol is close to $500 billion every year in the EU, tobacco over $250 billion. I mean, cannabis is easily here gonna be $250 billion to $500 billion, if not more, once this is established. But you only get a new industry like this once. .com happened, Industrial Revolution happened, cannabis is happening. I don't think jack shit's gonna happen in the rest of our lifetimes based on like our ages here. I mean, sustainable energies, when oil's still around, they're gonna lobby against that. That's good, but not cannabis. And we are recession-proof, even though the stocks are looking crazy, even though some sales are a little bit down right now. I mean, Vice Industries, like, it's a hard world right now. Cannabis is just gonna help that. So greatly appreciate the opportunity to share some of these insights with you today. And remember, like, we've been around. It's not like a new industry. Are people gonna use the internet or buy things on the internet? They've been doing this we've been using this for like millions of years as a species. We need industrial hemp to come back, not just novel cannabinoids like Delta-8 or CBD, like rope, textiles, plastics, and that sector, amazing as well, but lacking billions of infrastructure. But that's gonna replace so much with cotton and textiles and other petroleum-based industries. Like, this is like the one time that like, making good investments makes the world better and awesome fucking returns if you do it right. So really appreciate the opportunity, everyone. Thank you.
Nic Easley.